Hey guys, this is Calm, and I'm going to look at the ninth round in the FIDE World Rapid. We are black in this game as Mamedyarov, and we are playing against Alexander Grishchuk, 2779. Grishchuk's obviously a very good player, and he's got white in this game, so I would expect Mamedyarov wouldn't mind a draw in this game, but we're going to see. It's knight f6. Previously, Mamedyarov in this tournament was playing weird lines against d4, playing like d4, d5, c4, c5. But it seems that since he's against such a strong player here, he's going back to something more normal. With knight f3 here, I'd kind of expect to go into Catalan. Yeah, with g3. The other option here is just knight c3, just transposes to a normal. Queen's Gambit declined. We play d takes c line. This is fine. You can also play other lines where you don't capture on c4, but I think this is the most fashionable at the moment. You might think the problem is that, of course, white is trying to put this bishop on g2 regardless of how black plays, because he's already played g3 to open up this bishop and this diagonal, and by taking on c4 we're extending this diagonal for the bishop. But kind of the idea is that black wants to develop his own queenside quickly, and he does this with moves like b5, usually trying to support this pawn, which if white wants to take, he either has to do it with the queen, which loses time for the check, allows us to develop a piece, and then taking on c4 we can counteract this threat along this diagonal quite easily, because we play bishop d7, bishop c6 on those lines. Or white goes for something else like e3 and then tries to take with the bishop, but then this kind of works against the g3 he's already played. And because it kind of makes white make that critical decision, which pretty much always resolves by playing bishop g2, it seems like a pretty good way for black to immediately kind of relieve some of the slow bind pressure that's kind of typical for the Catalan that you might get against lower level players where they don't really understand the position, and they just know that normally in the Queen's Gambit they don't take on c4 because that's just what's, you know, in style kind of thing. So bishop g2 is played. Bishop e4 check. Okay, so this is a line. You can also play things like c5 here. You can play. I'm trying to remember. There was one line I used to play where I can't remember if it was an immediate b5 here, which you may think looks really bad because of knight e5, but then we have knight d5, and after e4 it gets complicated. I just remember that there are some lines which I analysed when I was trying to put together a repertoire, and basically we give this rook for this bishop, we take back the queen, we hold on to this pawn, and Rybka prefers it for black. It's never been played though, the full line that I went down, but it was very interesting but very complicated, and also because the line is never played, it means that, you know, is it really worth any study time at all? Probably not is the answer, because it's very unlikely to come up. But it just gave me more of a feel for these positions. It's kind of similar to some lines in the Grunfeld, where white gives up this a1 rook for the g7 bishop, and white just gets a ton of play for it. White doesn't get a pawn on those lines, but he gets a big attack, whereas here we're just trying to hold on to the pawn and we get a lot of space and things. I'd imagine black plays more normally here, as we can see with the bishop e4. Play bishop e7 as well, but bishop e4 is good. Bishop d2 is played. Okay, so there's some lines with a5 here, some with c5. I think we can just trade. I think we can play queen e7 as well. Basically, there's a lot of options. They're all pretty reasonable. I don't want to spend too much time in the opening, whilst we're still kind of in some theory, which we definitely are at the moment. So a5 is played, castles, and now bishop g5 once we've got out of this pin from this bishop, which is probably a good move because by taking this bishop, yes, we'd be doubling the pawn structure, we'd be opening up black's rook, and this rook can be a bit of a problem piece because it's on this long diagonal. So we're moving this bishop to a better position. Admittedly, I think it's not a big game for white because we can just play bishop e7 back as black. But equally, as black, we're not in any rush to do this because we're not under pressure of this being double attacked or anything, and we can just push it away with h6 and almost force the trade because if we go back to h5, then g5 would trap the piece. Yeah, so I'd expect black to try to continue his development. Knight d7 in these lines can be awkward because after knight e5 we can't trade because if he takes here, this f6 is a problem. After the trade of queens, we're still in a pin, it's just with the rook. And after knight d7, if we play knight b6, then this bishop is kind of stuck. So, I mean, you can play c5, but at the same time we've already got this kind of weird pawn structure. I'd want to play, I think, b5 immediately, and then if it's the case that knight e5 or something exerting pressure along this diagonal is played, we've played a5 already, so we can play, say, rook a7 or something, and this c4 pawn is already protected by this b5 pawn. So that looks pretty good for black, I think. And it is what's played. Okay, a4. So, if we play c6, we can get in trouble after knight e5, because then we have two pieces of whites attacking the c6 square, and only one knight defending, and this knight that's defending hasn't been developed at all, so it's not in the best spot. And if we try and defend it again, via, say, bishop b7, then a takes b4 opens up this rook, and also we can't recapture because of bishop takes bishop here. And if we play bishop d7 instead of bishop b7, then again, just a takes b, and after the recapture this rook hangs. So c6 looks really awkward. So I think we have to do something else. So if we play bishop d7, I can just trade, he opens up his rook. Our pawn structure's a bit weird. Kinda like that for white. So yeah, I'm not really sure. I mean, we can always just dissolve this weakness by taking on a4. But again, the thing with that is the pawn structure that it leaves I don't particularly like for black, because we have double pawns in the c-file, and we have an isolated a pawn. However, against that, we do have this isolated b pawn for white, so maybe the isolated a pawn here isn't a big deal because it's got a counterpart here. And with the c pawns, because we can play c5 quite quickly, like in one move, to dissolve it against this d4, I guess having this isolated c pawn is only a little bit of a weakness compared to the doubles pawns here. I still think it's better for white, because we're going to have two Islanis as black instead of the one of whites, but I'm not particularly seeing any other good ideas. That really help us out, because I don't like the idea of c6, so I'm not particularly sure what the best move is. Probably I think I would go for something like bishop a6 or bishop d7. Probably more bishop a6, because after bishop d7, knight e5 can be annoying. Because it attacks the bishop and also opens up this long pin. Whereas bishop a6, then if knight e5 comes, we can just play rook a7. Then again, if we take on a4, white's going to recapture at some point, and then we can play bishop d7. as planned in the previous line, but we do it with tempo because it's hitting one of these two major pieces of whites. So maybe you could argue that given our pawn structure is worse, we just want to develop as fast as possible, dissolve as many weaknesses as we can, and maybe taking an a4 allows us to do that quicker because we can play the bishop d7, then with the tempo we've gained we can play something like c5 next move. Then we can play something like bishop c6 or knight c6 and just kind of trade off everything. And the endgame is unclear to me because we do have this additional weakness of c4, but if we can somehow resolve that, then it would be very even. I guess we'll just see what Mamedyarov plays. Okay, so he does take here. So I was kind of wrong, but I was also kind of right because I eventually went into this and explained the advantages of it, so I'm not going to restate that here. It's knight e5 immediately. This is probably good for white because he can take a4 any time. There's no real danger of him pushing a3 because we can just take with the knight with tempo, so, well, not with tempo, but with development move. So white doesn't need to worry about that, so probably just trying to exploit black's behindness in development is the best. So rook a7. The idea of this over rook a6, I would imagine, is that we're going to play c5 in the future, and then this rook can come to d7 later on. It also prevents the taking up of the a6 square for something like our knight or our bishop, because, for example, if he takes on c4, we might play bishop a6 with tempo. And also it allows us to play bishop b7 at some point if we want to trade off these bishops, because the rook supports it. In the lines where we play bishop rook a6, of course we can do that. So takes a4, and bishop b7 is played. Okay, so white trades. I mean, I think white could go for more by playing f3 and e4, kind of taking all the centre there. But he's probably worried that he can get undermined by this c5 quickly, and if he does go for this f3 and e4 plan, this bishop is better than his because his is blocked in by his own pawns one square away, whereas this is slightly more scope. But trading does seem to dissolve quite a lot for me, so maybe Gushchuk has a better idea of how to win this endgame, just focusing on this isolated pawn. Although this isolated pawn, we have to remember, is actually a pawn advantage to black. So like, black can let white take that, and actually the material would be even. So I think before, when I was talking about how the endgame could be better for white because of this isolated pawn, I just forgot that this pawn was additional for black, and actually it would just be going to material equality, where we have this A pawn against the B pawn. So actually, I think that in-game is pretty much completely even. In which case, actually, I don't think black was in any real positional trouble in this line so far, and probably it's all still theory, so we're just trading here. Knight c3, normal developing move. Again, we don't have to rush, and this takes c4. By having this knight here, right now, we are helping in the pressure we're putting on black's camp, because black just wants to develop and solve these weaknesses. By having this knight here, we can't play knight c6 because we can take it. We can't play knight d7 because again we take it. And if black recaptured with the queen, then we can take on f6 and double the pawns, leave this isolated, which would be a small advantage for white in the endgame. So it makes sense to keep it there. There's nothing black can do that can save this pawn in the meantime, so we're not in any rush. h6, so it forces white to do something about this. Okay, and so he just takes an f6. I mean, I guess it's best. It's a little bit surprising to me because it seems like the more things we trade, the closer to a draw it gets. So if we're going for a win, maybe something like bishop e3 helps put pressure to stop this c5 push, but maybe he's worried then about something just like knight d5 simply, attacking this bishop, and if we trade then the recapture of the pawn will allow this pawn to stay strong and an advantage, so maybe actually White hasn't played this perfectly, or at least he's played a pretty unambitious line, to whereby he's trading a lot of pieces and he's just going to go into the endgame in pretty even circumstances. So I just expect takes d4 now, yep. Okay, so after rook d8, of course we have to note that White is attacking a4, a5 twice rather. So first with the knight and then with the rook, so we can win a pawn here. But this d4 pawn is also under attack after we play rook d8. And the problem with playing something like e3 is c5 can come. And if c5 comes, then yeah, we can take on a5 again, but again after the trade. Then c takes d, and then after e takes d, again we can take on d4, and again it's gone back to the even material. And although this a pawn is gone, we're still going to be left with this b pawn against black's pawn. As I was mentioning before, it's just going to be the c pawn instead of the a pawn, which again is basically the same thing. And now, given that White's just taken on a5, I think he's recognised that line, and he figures that either he's okay with a draw, or he just doesn't think he has anything better. Like, he'd rather okay, let's go back. So I think I misspoke before when I was saying with this b against c. In that line where I was talking about, where we've played c5 and we've taken on d4 and recaptures, of course it's not b against c, because this c is already taken on d4. So what that would leave us with is this isolated d pawn for White. Which ends up getting taken, so yeah, sorry, an isolated b pawn for White. So the d pawn is traded off with the e pawn and so on. So c5, e3 takes, you know, and trades there. So we have this pawn, this pawn, this pawn, and this pawn left for White, whereas Black has 4 pawns here. Okay, so Black has one less pawn island, but White has this pass pawn. So, in my opinion, having this pass pawn as White is going to leave better winning chances than trading off to a position where we have the c pawn against the b pawn, because obviously they can take each other. It should also be noted that in just a king and pawn endgame, like with a rook, a rook endgame, with just these 3 pawns against these 4 pawns, there's still going to be a draw. So if we go for the line where we just have this b pawn and not the c pawn, then, you know, we have winning chances, and even if we lose this pawn for nothing, we can still hold the draw. So I would have thought that's the best thing to go to, but I guess by taking on a5, he doesn't particularly agree, and he just wants the, you know, easier draw. And in terms of tournament situation, maybe they're both thinking they're both over 2750. It's a good enough result given the position on the board, and they don't want to risk anything. I know that Grishchuk's a really good rapid player though, so I would have thought if he thinks he can get more from the game, he would have gone for it, but as it turns out, we're going for this line instead. We've got the trades, and actually this rook attacks this b pawn, which I didn't even notice, so maybe the rest of my analysis is completely irrelevant. Knight c6 is played, it attacks this rook, it's developing with tempo, seems good. Plays rook b5, which stops the the capture of this b pawn. But at the same time, after the trade, we're going to be able to take on d4, and then if we trade the queens, we just snap rook endgame with the b pawn against the c pawn, like I mentioned before, and the one rook endgame is just going to be a draw. So he has traded, just take on d4, queen takes, and we have no moves, so draw was agreed here. So that was the 9th round. It seems kind of like it was, the Catalan is a very subtle opening. You'll see Kramnik use it with amazing success just because he's so good at this type of position, but although it looks like White's getting some positional edge, we have to remember that this c4 pawn is an advantage of a pawn that Black has already, so if he gives it back it's not a big issue, and if he's left with just this b pawn against the c pawn, as is pretty much guaranteed after the trade here, if Black can just dissolve this pressure along this diagonal like he could with the rook a7, bishop b7, it seems like he's not in that much trouble after all. So I think it's a good opening from Mamedyarov. He clearly knows what he's doing. He's playing a very high-rated player, and he got a 20-move draw against him. So with Black, he can't be unhappy with that. Okay, so this was the 9th round. I'll try and get on to the 10th soon. I hope you enjoyed the commentary.